Hey guys, Mountain Ripper back. Want to do a short video on lenses and how they work. It's kind of an addition to the other two videos that I did on manual photography. And just wanted to do a quick video. I promise I will get back into doing my backpacking videos. I've been building this fort here, this tree house, and it's taken up a lot of time, so we will be getting back to that. And but for now, let's jump into this lens. Like way back when, before lenses were even around, they had the pinhole, which is a little bitty, tiny little hole, where when the light hit it and went through that pinhole, it would actually form an image on a wall or inside of a box or something like that. And basically, what the lens has done, with the modern camera lenses, or even back 100 years, the lenses back then, you have a bigger glass area, you have a bigger area, which allows you to form a bigger image and allows a greater surface of the glass area so you can get more light through there. And when the light goes through there, it will the light will refract off the glass, and it will curve the rays of light, which can form an image usually around the rear natal point of the lens, which is usually pretty close to where the aperture is. And you can determine that by your focal length of how far that glass is in the front back to the rear nodal point, and that is your focal length. And the more focal length you have, the less view you're going to have coming through the lens. So if you have a shorter lens, in other words, if that front glass is closer to that rear nodal point on the lens, you're going to get more area for what your subject is. So the shorter the lens, the more area you're going to have that you can see around your subject. With a longer lens, you're going to have less area around your subject. And it's an amazing thing that it's one of the most amazing inventions, a camera lens, because that glass forms an image, which opens up a whole new world with depth of field and selective focus. You can use different focal lengths to get different effects, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. How does that lens form that image on the sensor plane or the ground glass or the whatever medium you're using for photography? And you can use that lens for that. And so let's talk a little bit about how that lens forms an image. Okay, so when you're considering focal length, if you have, it doesn't matter what format of camera that you're on, the focal length will always be the same. So let's say you're on a 35 millimeter camera with a 50 millimeter lens. The subject that you're looking at through that lens might be, say, 1 inch high. And if you take that same focal length and put it onto a medium format camera or view camera, a large format camera, you're still going to have that same size image. It's going to be 1 inch. However, the format is so much bigger that 1 inch is going to look small because you've gone to a bigger format. So that's why when you go to a bigger format camera, when you just go up in steps, they say a normal lens for a 35 millimeter camera is 50, and then normal was, say, 90 for a medium format camera, where you're essentially doubling the size of the area of the where the film plane is or your image sensor is. So that 1 inch is going to appear smaller on that bigger format. And you step up to a 4x5 camera, that 1 inch is just going to be a small portion of a 4x5 inch frame. However, the focal length doesn't change even when you go up and down in formats. But so, having considered that, when you go to a longer lens, when you go from 50 millimeters to 100 millimeters on your 35 millimeter lens, if your image is 1 inch, that essentially fills the whole frame, right? So if you go from a 50 millimeter to a 100 millimeter, you're going to double the size of that subject. So it's no longer going to fit in that format, so you would either have to move back or switch to a smaller lens to fit your subject in. So that's what happens when you go to a longer lens, which is increasing the magnification. So the longer the lens you have, the bigger the subject is going to be within that format that you're on. So that kind of just describes focal length and how it works. The subject that you're focusing on, that is in your image, is going to double in size every time you double your focal length. And that's one of the reasons why you have different lenses in your kit. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how the aperture works on a camera. Basically, how you can figure out the aperture on your lens is essentially, it's basically a mathematical formula and how it's determined. The aperture is essentially a fraction of the focal length. For example, if you have a 4-inch lens, a 4-inch long lens, and the barrel of that lens, or the diameter of that lens, is 1 inch, then it's basically going to be a 4-to-1 ratio of your lens length to your lens diameter, which you would call it to be 4-to-1, which in photography terms would be f4. So let's say that we were to cut the diameter of that lens in half, and you still have a 4-inch lens, but your diameter of your lens now is only a 1/2 inch. So that would be an 8-to-1 ratio, right? Because it's 1/2 to 4. So you'd have 8 halves to make that 4, which will make it f8, which is 1/8 of the focal length at that point. And as you go on down the line, as you make that diameter smaller and smaller, your f-stop will get smaller and smaller, your focal length. So that's how you can figure out in your head how the smaller the aperture is, the more depth of field you're going to get. And that's just a rule of thumb, and that is stopping down the lens. That's what we call it, and you're stopping down and closing down the lens. So we can look at it that way. Just to recap, if it's a 4-inch lens, it's got a 1-inch open, that's a 4-to-1 ratio, which would put you at f4. And then if you go to a 1/2 inch, that would be f8. If you go to a 1/4 inch, that would be f16. If you go to a 1/8 of an inch, it would be f22. And so on down the line. So that's a good way to understand how that works in a lens with your aperture. So for what we're going to use those f-stops for in creating our image is going to be determined by how much light do we want to allow to travel through that lens. When we have a larger lens opening, let's say f2.8, we're allowing essentially the maximum amount of light to transfer through that lens that the lens will allow to transfer for the way that lens is designed. That's the most amount of light that's going to be able to go through there, which is quite a bit of light. And as you close down your aperture to a smaller number, you're actually letting in less light. So as you go from f.8, 2.8 to 4 to 5, 6 to 8, 11, 16, think of it as a fraction, 1/16 of the focal length, you're letting in less light. And that is how you're controlling how much light is flowing through that lens, or going through the lens towards the sensor. So you can control your light by the size of that aperture, and also combining it with the amount of time that aperture is open. And that's what we call those stops, or f-stops now, and that is how it's determined on the lens barrel or on your settings on your camera to set your f-stop. Okay, depth of field. What is depth of field? Depth of field is how much area is acceptably sharp in front of and behind the subject. So if you want, there's only ever going to be one spot the camera will only focus properly on one plane. So by controlling your depth of field, you can control what is acceptably sharp in front of the subject and behind the subject. I know I've explained this in my other video, but just going over it one more time. So as you stop down the lens, you're going to have more acceptable focus in front of and behind your subject. And that is referred to as depth of field. When you're considering depth of field, there's three elements that you're concerned with. The first element will be, what is your focal length? The second element will be your subject distance, how far or near the camera. And the third selection would be your aperture. So the closer, or your focal length too, the closer the subject is to your camera and the more magnification you have, the less depth of field you're going to have. So if you have a subject that is moving closer to the camera and you want to maintain your depth of field, you will have to switch to a wider angle lens. That's just the property of the way lenses work. So the longer the focal length, the less depth of field you're going to have. And the wider the lens, the more focal length you're going to have. So that's how you can base a decision on how much depth of field do you want to have. If you want to have everything tack sharp in your picture, you're going to want a wider angle lens, and you're going to want your subject to be further from the camera. When doing that, you will achieve the greatest amount of depth of field, rather than having a longer lens and your subject close to the camera, thereby giving you very minimal depth of field. A term commonly used with your depth of field is circles of confusion. And that I got out of Ansel Adams' book called The Camera, and it's a way of describing how the lens forms an image and establishes your depth of field. So like when you have your lens and you have your subject distance from the lens and you focus on that subject is the sharp point on your plane of focus. So any distance that you move in front or behind that subject is gonna form a little circular disc on the lens, or projecting onto the film plane, and that little circle, that little disc, is called a circle of confusion. And those little discs, the closer that they get to the subject plane, the smaller they get. And depending on how big your print size is going to be, then the acceptable size of your circle of confusion, the bigger the print, the bigger the circle of confusion can be within the acceptable point of focus, which you would find to be acceptably in focus. So if you were to go to a wider lens, and at that point the subject would appear to be further away, and at the same time a benefit you get there as far as depth of field goes is that circle of confusion, that little disc, that circular disc, gets smaller as it gets closer to the image. So you can control that by your focal length and the subject distance, which I've already mentioned. But as far as the circle of confusion is concerned, usually within a print, or I think like on the film, if it needs to be like 1/1000th of the size of the print to be acceptably sharp. It is a circle of confusion. So once it gets bigger than that, it is at that point considered to be out of focus. So as you're controlling your depth of field, and you want more depth of field for your images to look sharp from the front to the back, you're going to want to decrease the size of those circles of confusion as best as possible. Likewise, if you want to use selective focus and you want to have something in the focus in the subject that's really sharp, then everything else completely out of focus, then you're going to want to maximize that. And how are you going to maximize that? You're going to do that by having the subject closer to your camera, and your focal length greater, a longer focal length that you can get, which will thereby create large circles of confusion or long out of focus little discs within your image to create, as a new popular term is bokeh. That's basically what your circles of confusion are. Is just got a greater bokeh, you got a greater circle of confusion. So that's kind of a simple way to put it, but that's what you're looking for with your selective focus. So hopefully this has helped you. Hopefully I haven't been confusing. To try and describe how your focal length works and how your aperture works together to synchronize your image on the film plane. And do, as I said in other videos, you will use your shutter speed to control how long that image is allowed to form on that sensor or film plane, if it's a 60th of a second or a 100th of a second. Depending on how small that aperture is in your lens, the more time you're going to need to expose. Which is why you see a lot of tripods and things like that, because you really need that to keep your camera steady if you really want to have a good sharp image. And remember what I've said in the other videos about that. I mean, there's other factors that go into this. This video just I just want to talk to you a little bit about circles of confusion and how the image is formed through the glass. And I hope this video has helped a little bit. And thanks for watching.